The phone call that changed everything, Mom. There's a man pointing a gun at me. The words cut through the conference room chatter like a knife through silence. My daughter Jessica's voice came through the phone with that eerily calm tone she used in crisis situations. The kind of calm that made my blood run cold because I knew it meant she was assessing a genuine threat. Don't worry, I'll handle it, she continued with the same measured cadence. But you might want to come home now before this guy becomes the evening news. I was on my feet before she finished the sentence. Grabbing my briefcase and rushing out of the conference room, my colleagues' startled faces blurred past as I headed for the elevator. 23 floors had never felt so long. We had moved into this neighborhood just 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. Who would have thought the homeowners association would welcome my daughter with a gun barrel pointed at her face? They picked the wrong house. More importantly, they had no idea who she was. If you're watching this video from an HOA nightmare of your own, drop a comment below and let me know what ridiculous rules they've tried to enforce on you. Trust me, after what we went through, your story might not seem so crazy anymore. A dream that became a nightmare. I never thought I'd be in this situation. After 20 years of marriage that ended in a surprisingly amicable divorce, I finally purchased my dream home in Oakwood Estates. I expected peace. That's what the glossy brochure promised. Anyway, a peaceful, well-maintained community where neighbors become family. What it should have said was a tyrannical micro-kingdom, where your property isn't really yours, and armed wannabe cops might threaten your loved ones. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and explain how this nightmare began. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 45 years old and work as a consumer rights attorney in Chicago. After the divorce was finalized, I wanted a fresh start in a nice neighborhood with good security and beautiful Oakwood Estates checked all those boxes on paper. The colonial-style homes sat perfectly manicured, like something from a magazine. The tree-lined streets looked safe and inviting. The neighbors I met during the open house seemed friendly and welcoming. The realtor mentioned there was an active homeowners association, but honestly, I didn't think much of it. I'd lived with HOA rules before during my marriage. How bad could it be? The answer, much worse than I could have ever imagined. The welcome wagon from Helon, my first official day as a homeowner. I was busy arranging furniture in what would become my new life when the doorbell rang. A nervous-looking woman in her early 50s stood on my doorstep, clutching a thick 3-ring binder like it contained state secrets. "Welcome to Oakwood Estates, Mrs. Mitchell," she said with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Karen Wilson, the HOA secretary. This is your welcome package and rulebook. Please review it as soon as possible to avoid any incidents." The way she emphasized the word incidents made it sound like breaking HOA rules might result in some sort of public flogging. I thanked her and took the hefty binder, noticing how she glanced nervously over her shoulder before hurrying back to her car like she was escaping something. Strange behavior, but I chalked it up to social awkwardness. Boy, was I wrong about that. Later that evening, I settled into my favorite chair with a cup of tea and flipped through the rulebook. My attorney brain immediately started spotting numerous legally questionable provisions scattered throughout the pages like landmines. No parking on the street between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., even for guests. No gatherings of more than 8 people without prior HOA approval. Mandatory attendance at quarterly HOA meetings with fines for absences. Fines starting at $50 for first offenses, doubling with each subsequent violation. But the most absurd provision made me do a double. The HOA board reserves the right to enter properties with 24-hour notice to inspect for compliance with regulations. That provision alone was completely a clear violation of basic property rights. I made mental notes to clarify these issues at the next HOA meeting, then set the binder aside and focused on making my new house feel like home. Little did I know I was already being watched. Already being targeted before I'd even unpacked my first box. My daughter arrives a week later. My daughter Jessica arrived for what was supposed to be a relaxing 2-week vacation visit. At 32, Jessica was my pride and joy. Brilliant, level-headed, and accomplished in ways that made me burst with maternal pride every time I thought about her career. What few people knew, including our new neighbors, was that Jessica was an FBI tactical team commander with 10 years of experience in high-stress situations that would make most people's nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. She didn't advertise her profession, preferring to describe herself simply as a government employee when people asked what she did for work. I was thrilled to have her staying with me. Not only had I missed her terribly since she'd been stationed at the DC office, but I also wanted her professional advice on some home security upgrades I was considering. After all, who better to consult about security than someone who dealt with the most dangerous criminals in the country on a daily basis? The morning after Jessica arrived, we were enjoying coffee on the front porch, catching up on each other's lives, when a small, elderly woman approached from the house next door. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate the world with both wisdom and caution. "You must be Sarah's daughter," she said warmly, extending a weathered but firm hand to Jessica. I'm Linda Thompson, the neighborhood gossip, according to our illustrious HOA president. She chuckled with genuine warmth, but there was something sharp and knowing in her eyes. Welcome to our little kingdom. Just be careful not to break any of the royal decrees, or you'll meet our self-appointed security chief, Doug. He thinks that badge he bought online makes him the sheriff of Oakwood County. Linda had a conspiratorial glint in her eye that immediately made me like her. She lowered her voice theatrically, glancing around as if checking for eaves. Watch out for Richard Connors, our HOA president. He's a former cop who retired early under what you might call mysterious circumstances. Word around the neighborhood is he was forced out after some scandal, but his buddies in the department helped him avoid any real consequences. Now he runs this place like it's his personal fiefdom. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. And Doug Peterson is his loyal enforcer. Think of him as Richard's personal attack dog, except with less training and more delusions of authority. The first warning signs that afternoon, while Jessica helped me unpack the last few boxes, I told her about the ridiculous HOA rules I'd discovered in that massive binder. She listened with the focused attention she brought to all potentially problematic situations, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she was already thinking several steps ahead. Sounds like someone with serious control issues, she observed, expertly arranging my book collection with the methodical precision that marked everything she did. I've seen this before in various contexts. Small amounts of power in limited domains can go to people's heads in dangerous ways. Usually it's just annoying rather than actually threatening. How quickly we would discover just how wrong that assessment was. That evening, I made what seemed like an innocent mistake. I parked my car apparently 2 inches over the designated parking space line. It was a line that wasn't even visible in the dim street lighting, painted in faded yellow that had worn away to almost nothing. The next morning, a bright orange violation notice was stuck under my windshield wiper like some sort of scarlet letter. Violation, improper fine, $50, payable within 7 days to avoid additional penalties. This is absolutely ridiculous, I said to Jessica over breakfast, waving the orange notice in the air like evidence of some grand injustice. I'm not paying $50 for being 2 inches over an invisible line that probably isn't even legally enforceable anyway. Jessica examined the notice with her trained investigator's eye, immediately catching details that I'd missed in my initial outrage. Mom, look at the signature line. This wasn't issued by the HOA board directly. It's signed by DEA Peterson. Security enforcement. Is that even an official position according to your bylaw? She had a point. I'd read through that entire rulebook, and nowhere did it mention any security enforcement position or give any individual the authority to issue fines independently. I was already composing an email to the HOA board in my head, citing specific state laws regarding reasonable enforcement of covenant restrictions. As a consumer rights attorney, I couldn't let this slide, not just for myself, but on principle. Small abuses of power left unchecked always grow into larger ones. It's a pattern I'd seen countless times in my legal career. The phone call that revealed everything less than 30 minutes after sending my carefully worded legal email to the HOA board. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize, but something told me I should answer it. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Richard Connors, Oakwood Estates, HOA president. His voice was deep and authoritative, with a forced politeness that didn't mask the underlying irritation simmering just beneath the surface. I received your concerns about our parking enforcement, he continued, emphasizing the word concerns like I'd submitted some sort of frivolous complaint. Perhaps as a newcomer to our community, you don't fully understand how things work here. We maintain our property values through strict adherence to our established rules and regulations. Everyone follows them without exception. No special treatment, no excuses. He paused, letting that sink in before adding with a harder edge to his voice, I strongly suggest you pay the fine immediately and adjust your attitude. Accordingly, before I could respond with the legal precedents I'd already researched, he continued, his tone becoming openly threatening. Oakwood Estates might not be the right fit for people who can't follow simple community standards. Things tend to get very uncomfortable for troublemakers who disrupt our peaceful community. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between us like a challenge. Then he added, the next HOA meeting is tomorrow evening. Attendance is mandatory. 7 o'clock sharp at the community center. I trust we'll see you there. He hung up before I could say another word, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. In all my years practicing law, dealing with corporate bullies and aggressive opposing counsel, I'd rarely encountered such blatant intimidation tactics outside of a courtroom. The midnight vandal that evening, Jessica and I were discussing strategies for the upcoming HOA meeting when we heard a strange noise from the direction of our front yard. Jessica, whose training made her perpetually alert to unusual sounds, was at the window in seconds. Mom, you need to see this, she said quietly, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant trouble was brewing. joined her at the window just in time to watch a heavy-set man in what looked like a cheap security uniform using bright red spray paint to draw a large, aggressive X across our front lawn. The symbol was crude but unmistakable. We were being marked as targets. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I called out, rushing to the front door with righteous anger propelling me forward. The man turned slowly and deliberately, taking his time to finish his vandalism before facing me with obvious contempt. "Official HOA warning, ma'am," he said with mock formality. "This property has received multiple compliance notices and failed to respond appropriately." "Multiple notices," I shot back. "We received exactly one parking ticket this morning, and I've already disputed it through proper channels." He smiled unpleasantly, tapping the holster on his belt in a gesture that wasn't subtle at all. "This is your final warning before we're forced to take further action. I'd suggest you think very carefully about your next move." With that threat hanging in the air, he walked away to a car parked across the street, making sure we saw him watching our house before driving away. I was absolutely furious, but Jessica's expression remained calm, almost amused. There was something calculating in her eyes that I'd seen before when she was working particularly challenging cases. "Did he just imply he might use a weapon over a parking violation?" she asked quietly, pulling out her phone to take detailed photos of our vandalized lawn from multiple angles. "Mom," she said with that dangerous smile I'd learned to recognize over the years, "I think I'm going to stick around a bit longer than originally planned." This situation just became very interesting from a professional standpoint. There was something in her tone that made me pause, not fear or concern, but the calculated interest of someone who had just spotted a puzzle they were particularly well qualified to solve. "I don't know what that red X is supposed to mean," I told her, staring at the ugly symbol marring our previously pristine lawn. Jessica's smile was unsettling in its quiet confidence. "No, Mom, they've just marked themselves as the type of bullies who don't know when they're picking on exactly the wrong people." The community meeting from health the next evening. We arrived at the community center for the HOA meeting to find about 40 residents, already seated in neat rows of folding chairs. The atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a community gathering. With nervous energy crackling through the room, Richard Connors stood at the front like a general addressing his troops. He was a tall man with silver hair and the rigid military posture of someone who genuinely enjoyed wielding authority over others. Doug, our lawn vandal from the previous night, hovered nearby like a loyal guard dog waiting for orders. I recognized Karen Wilson, the nervous secretary who'd delivered my welcome package, sitting behind a small table with meeting minutes and financial reports spread out before her. She studiously avoided eye contact when we walked in, confirming my growing suspicion that she knew more about this organization's true nature than her timid demeanor suggested. People spoke in hushed, uncomfortable tones that fell completely silent when Richard called the meeting to order with the sharp crack of a gavel. "Before we begin tonight's proceedings," Richard announced, his voice carrying easily through the room, "let's take a moment to welcome our newest resident, Sarah Mitchell." All eyes turned to me with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. "Mrs. Mitchell has already demonstrated her unique perspective on our community standards," Richard continued with a cold smile that made several people shift uncomfortably. In their seats, a few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but most faces remained carefully impassive. I was beginning to understand that fear, not community spirit, governed the dynamics of these meetings. For the next 45 minutes, I watched in horrified fascination as Richard and Doug ran the meeting like petty dictators ruling over a captive population. Residents who asked reasonable questions about increasing landscaping costs were quickly shut down, with vague references to necessary improvements that were never explained or justified. When a man I would later learn was Michael Garcia questioned why security expenses had tripled over the past 6 months, Richard interrupted him before he could finish his sentence. "We've discussed this before, Michael," Richard said with obvious irritation. "Increased security measures are absolutely non-negotiable given recent regional incidents that I'm not at liberty to discuss in detail. No specifics were offered about these supposed regional incidents, and Michael wasn't allowed to ask follow-up questions." I watched residents exchanging meaningful glances but remaining silent, and the atmosphere of intimidation became almost suffocating. When the financial report concluded without any real financial details being shared, I raised my hand to ask the questions that clearly needed asking. Richard pointedly looked elsewhere until no other hands remained raised. "Yep, Mrs. Mitchell," he finally acknowledged with barely concealed annoyance. "I suppose you have something to add to our discussion." "I have several questions about the legal basis for some of your enforcement protocols," I began, keeping my voice steady and professional. "Particularly, the provision allowing HOA representatives to enter private property for compliance inspections. That directly contradicts established state property laws unless specific consent was established." In the original property deeds, the room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. "Additionally," I continued, pressing my advantage while I had everyone's attention, Your fine structure exceeds what's legally permissible under state statutes governing homeowners associations, specifically Code Section 27 to 45.3. Richard's face flushed red, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the podium. Mrs. Mitchell, we certainly appreciate your legal opinions, he said through gritted teeth. However, our covenant was established with guidance from top HOA attorneys in the state. These matters were thoroughly researched and properly settled long before you arrived in our community. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was genuine menace in his voice when he added, if you'd spend as much time reading your welcome package as you apparently spent trying to find loopholes in our established procedures, you'd understand that by purchasing property in Oakwood Estates, you've already legally consented to our governance structure. The dismissive tone was clearly meant to humiliate me in front of the other residents, and I felt heat rising in my cheeks. But years of courtroom experience had taught me never to show when an opponent had managed to land a blow. Perhaps, Richard concluded with cruel satisfaction, in your next home purchase, you'll do more thorough research before buying into a community whose values don't align with your personal preferences. The secret alliance forms as the meeting concluded, with the same authoritarian efficiency it had begun. I noticed Karen Wilson discreetly slipping a folded piece of paper into my hand as I passed her table. Outside in the parking lot, under the dim streetlights, I unfolded it to read. Be careful. Cameras and microphones in all common areas. They're watching everything. We need to talk. Before I could fully process this warning, Doug deliberately bumped into me, nearly knocking me off balance with what was clearly intentional aggression. We know how to handle people like you, he muttered just loudly enough for me to hear clearly. Ask the Johnsons why they sold their house so quickly last year. Maybe you'll learn something useful. With that ominous threat hanging in the air, he walked to his car, the same vehicle that had been parked across from our house the night before, confirming that we were indeed under some form of surveillance. When I returned home, still processing everything that had happened, I found Jessica in animated conversation with Linda Thompson and a man I didn't recognize. They were sitting in our living room like old friends planning a revolution. Mom, Jessica said, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement she usually reserved for particularly challenging FBI cases. I think we just found ourselves a small army to fight the neighborhood tyrant. She gestured to the unfamiliar man. This is Michael Garcia, the same resident who asked the inconvenient questions about security expenses at tonight's meeting. It turns out Michael has some very interesting security footage that you absolutely need to see. Before she could elaborate further, my phone chimed with an email notification. The subject line made my blood run cold. Serious violation, $500 fine. The email came from Richard Connor's official HOA address, sent less than an hour after the meeting had ended. Unauthorized gathering, exceeding approved occupancy limits. I read aloud from my phone in disbelief. This is completely absurd. They're actually claiming that having guests in our own home violates HOA regulations. Michael nodded grimly, the expression of someone who'd been through this exact scenario before. They pulled the same intimidation tactic with me last month when I hosted my brother's family for a weekend visit. Called it an unregistered event, exceeding residential occupancy guidelines. The real issue was that I'd been asking too many questions about their financial reports and where all the money was actually going. He leaned forward conspiratorially. This is exactly how they operate. They manufacture any excuse they can find to pressure people who don't fall in line with their authority, question their decisions. And suddenly you're drowning in violation notices and escalating fines. Linda sipped her tea thoughtfully, nodding in agreement. They've been perfecting this system for years. Most people just pay whatever fines they're given to avoid ongoing conflict. It's easier and cheaper than fighting back. Or so it seems at first. She leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting years to share this information. But those who do try to fight back somehow find themselves with mysteriously broken windows that neighborhood kids must have caused, or plumbing issues that only seem to affect their specific properties, or cars that get keyed in their own driveways. But, Linda added with a sly smile, the Mitchell family aren't like most people, are they? Jessica grinned with the kind of determined expression I hadn't seen since she'd taken down a notorious fraud ring 3 years earlier. Michael has been documenting Richard and Doug's activities for months. Show her what you've collected. The evidence emerged as Michael opened his laptop and began playing a series of video clips from his home security system. What I saw made my attorney instincts go into overdrive. The first clip showed Richard and Doug accepting cash payments from a construction contractor who was clearly working on a house renovation without the proper permits that the HOA was supposedly so strict about enforcing. The second showed Doug systematically placing violation notices only on the homes of residents who had questioned board decisions at recent meetings, while ignoring identical, or worse, violations at houses belonging to Richard's supporters. Most disturbing was a clip of Richard and a well-dressed businessman examining various houses throughout the neighborhood while consulting what appeared to be a detailed list that included property addresses, including mine. They've got a target list, Michael explained, pausing the footage on Richard's face as he pointed directly at our house. Specific homes they want to force into sales because the locations are prime for redevelopment. Once the new commercial zoning gets approved across the highway. Linda pulled a small, worn notebook from her purse with the practiced motion of someone who'd been keeping records for a long time. I'm a retired investigative journalist, and old habits die hard. I've been documenting every suspicious activity since Richard took control of the HOA 3 years ago. She flipped through pages of meticulous notes, dates, and observations. 26 families have been systematically forced out through harassment, selective enforcement, and what I would characterize as outright intimidation tactics. The really interesting pattern is what happens to their houses after they're forced to sell. The properties are always purchased by various shell companies that, when you dig deep enough, trace back to Richard's brother-in-law's real estate investment firm. They're buying these homes at significantly reduced prices from harassed homeowners, then sitting on the properties until the commercial rezoning goes through next year. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just petty power abuse or neighborhood politics gone wrong. It was a carefully calculated real estate scheme, designed to systematically defraud homeowners out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in property value. So they're not just neighborhood tyrants getting off on controlling people's lives, I said, feeling the familiar fire that always ignited when I encountered systematic injustice. They're sophisticated real estate predators who found a way to weaponize the HOA structure. As a consumer rights attorney, I'd seen countless schemes designed to defraud ordinary people out of their money and property. But this one struck a particularly deep chord because it was happening in my own neighborhood. Two people who had trusted their community leadership. Jessica takes charge. Jessica was studying Michael's footage with the intense, analytical focus I'd seen her apply to complex FBI cases. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted patterns and connections that would be invisible to most people. Look at their escalation pattern, she said, pointing to specific details in the recordings. They start with minor violations and small fines to test resistance levels. Then they move to increasingly absurd infractions with larger penalties designed to create financial pressure. Next comes manufactured maintenance issues that make daily life uncomfortable and expensive. She paused the footage on a particularly clear shot of Richard's expression as he accepted cash from the contractor. Finally, they resort to direct intimidation when the financial pressure isn't enough to force compliance. But look at his face here, she continued, zooming in on Richard's expression. That's not just greed or simple corruption. That's the look of someone who genuinely enjoys wielding power over others. He's not just after money, he's getting real, psychological satisfaction from controlling people's lives and making them afraid. Linda nodded knowingly. That's exactly right. I've interviewed dozens of corrupt officials throughout my journalism career, and there's a specific personality type that's drawn to positions of petty authority precisely because they can inflict suffering with relative impunity. The HOA structure is absolutely perfect for people like Richard, she continued. Minimal oversight from external authorities, broad enforcement powers that most residents don't understand, and a captive audience who literally can't escape the situation without selling their homes and moving away. Michael added another disturbing piece to the puzzle. My security system captured something else last week that you need to know about. Richard was giving Doug specific instructions about which houses to target next with violation notices and harassment. He pulled up another video file. He specifically mentioned your house, Sarah, saying you were going to be a major problem that needed to be dealt with quickly and decisively. He already had detailed plans to squeeze you out before you even challenged him at that meeting. The thought that I had been marked for harassment from the moment I moved in sent a chill down my spine, quickly followed by white-hot anger. These bullies had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with, a seasoned consumer rights attorney and an FBI tactical commander who specialized in taking down organized criminals. The retaliation begins the next morning. I filed a formal complaint with the City Housing Authority about the HOA's illegal practices and unenforceable regulations. By that afternoon, our water service had been mysteriously shut off. Emergency maintenance on your section of the water line, Doug announced when I confronted him about the convenient timing. Not even bothering to hide his satisfied smirk, should be back on in 6 hours or so, assuming we don't run into any complications. He paused, enjoying the moment. HOA regulations specifically permit essential infrastructure maintenance at our discretion for community safety reasons. Maybe you should keep a few cases of bottled water handy next time you decide to file unnecessary complaints with outside authorities. Jessica watched this entire exchange from our front porch, her expression remaining perfectly neutral while her eyes performed the kind of tactical assessment she'd been trained to do automatically in potentially dangerous situations. That evening, while I was trapped on a conference call with colleagues trying to explain why I might not be available for the next few days, Jessica quietly installed hidden security cameras around our property using sophisticated equipment she'd borrowed from FBI resources, just standard precautions. she assured me when I noticed the small, nearly invisible devices she was positioning with military precision. Nothing that would compromise any potential official investigation, but enough to document whatever they try next. That night, we noticed Doug's car parked across the street from our house, with him occasionally shining a bright flashlight toward our windows in obvious attempts to disturb our sleep and make us feel unsafe. Classic intimidation tactics, Jessica explained, seemingly unaffected by the psychological warfare being waged against us. They're trying to make us uncomfortable enough to either fall completely in line or decide that moving away is easier than continuing to fight. She was typing something on her phone as she spoke, her fingers moving with the rapid precision of someone sending important communications. It's legally ambiguous enough that if we called regular police, they'd probably just say he's conducting authorized neighborhood security patrols. A few minutes later, her phone chimed with a text message that made her smile with genuine satisfaction. Remember Karen, the nervous HOA secretary who slipped me that warning note? She just texted me with a request to meet tomorrow morning at the Riverdale coffee shop across town. Says she has information that can help us, but she needs to be very careful about how she shares it. Jessica's confident smile carried just a hint of predatory satisfaction. Mom, I think we just recruited ourselves an inside source in the enemy's headquarters. The secret meeting, the Riverdale coffee shop, was perfectly chosen for a clandestine meeting, busy enough to provide anonymity, but quiet enough for sensitive conversation. Jessica arrived early, securing a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances. A habit from her FBI training that had become automatic. Karen arrived precisely on time, nervously scanning the room before sitting down with the careful movements of someone who knew she was taking serious personal risks. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. What I'm about to share with you could cost me my job, and potentially much worse than that if Richard finds out. Jessica nodded encouragingly, her posture relaxed but alert. Take all the time you need. We really appreciate any help you can offer, and we'll do everything possible to protect your identity and safety. Karen extracted a small USB drive from her purse, sliding it across the table like she was passing state secrets. I've been secretly documenting financial discrepancies and illegal activities for almost 2 years now. Richard doesn't know that I have extensive accounting experience from my previous career. He thinks I'm just a glorified secretary who mindlessly follows orders. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued. There's nearly $500,000 missing from the HOA reserve funds, systematically funneled through fake maintenance companies and consulting fees that all ultimately lead back to shell corporations controlled by Richard's family members. Richard thinks he's being very clever about covering his tracks, but he's not nearly as sophisticated as he believes. Every transaction leaves digital footprints, and I've been carefully documenting all of them. Karen's voice grew stronger as she shared information she'd clearly been desperate to reveal for months. My elderly mother used to live in Oakwood Estates before I moved here. Richard and Doug harassed her relentlessly for months when she dared to oppose their arbitrary fee increases, strange phone calls at all hours of the night, deliberate vandalism that the security cameras somehow never managed to capture, mysterious water damage that required expensive repairs. They made her life absolutely miserable until she finally sold her house for 30% below market value to Richard's brother-in-law's investment company. I took the HOA secretary position, specifically to find concrete proof of what they did to her and to all the other families they've systematically targeted. Now, I finally have enough evidence to expose their entire operation. The financial web unravels. Why Jessica was meeting with Karen and gathering explosive evidence of financial fraud. I made a disturbing discovery of my own. A new line item had appeared on our monthly HOA statement. Enhanced security assessment, $200 month. When I called the HOA office to question this unauthorized charge, I was told it was a special assessment approved by the board due to increased security concerns in the neighborhood. Conveniently, no such security concerns had been mentioned at any recent meetings, and no vote for special assessments had taken place with homeowner input. I was drafting a formal legal response citing specific violations of HOA governance procedures. When Jessica returned from her meeting with Karen, her expression carried that particular combination of concern and determination that meant she uncovered something significant. They're targeting your house. Specifically, she explained without preamble, showing me printed documents that Karen had provided as evidence. Your property is one of 5 homes that would complete a contiguous block of real estate their investment group needs to control before the commercial rezoning application goes through city planning next month. She pulled up a detailed map on her laptop showing current property ownership throughout our neighborhood, with nearly 30% of homes now owned by various LLC entities that Karen had confirmed were all connected to Richard's brother-in-law's investment firm. This isn't just simple HOA corruption or a power-hungry board president, Jessica continued. This is organized real estate fraud on a massive scale. They're systematically manufacturing reasons to fine and harass targeted homeowners, artificially driving down property values and forcing distressed sales, all while Richard's family businesses profit from both sides of every transaction. The scope of the scheme was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. These weren't just neighborhood bullies getting off on petty authority. They were sophisticated criminals who had found a way to use the legal structure of homeowners associations as a weapon for systematic theft. The FBI gets involved that evening. Jessica contacted her colleague, Agent Thomas Davis, at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, asking him to run comprehensive background checks on both Richard Connors and Doug Peterson. While we waited for his response, I discovered that my car had been vandalized overnight. Someone had spray-painted the words, "Comply or Leave," across the driver's side in the same bright red paint Doug had used to mark our lawn. We carefully documented everything, adding these new photos to our growing file of evidence. Agent Thomas called back the next day with information that was both disturbing and oddly satisfying. Richard Connors had been forced to resign from the police department after accumulating multiple excessive force complaints and becoming the subject of an internal affairs investigation into evidence tampering and potential corruption. Criminal charges had been filed, but were mysteriously dropped under circumstances that suggested influence from well-placed allies within the department. Doug Peterson had no legitimate security credentials of any kind, and his concealed carry permit had been revoked 3 years earlier after an incident involving brandishing a weapon at a supermarket customer during an argument over a parking space. Most significantly, there was already an ongoing federal investigation into money laundering schemes operating through several homeowners associations throughout our county, including Oakwood Estates. Our complaint and evidence would be incorporated into a much larger case that had been building for months. Jessica had just finished briefing me on this information when her phone buzzed with an urgent text message from Michael Garcia. "Emergency. Doug at my door with a gun. Need help now?" She was on her feet and grabbing her car keys before I could fully process what was happening. "Stay here and call local police immediately," she instructed with the crisp authority of someone switching into full tactical mode. "Tell them this is a potential armed standoff situation to ensure they take it seriously and respond appropriately. I'm going over there right now." Before I could voice my concerns or objections, she was out the door, moving with the focused efficiency I'd seen only when she was operating in full FBI mode. The confrontation, I could barely breathe as I made the emergency call, reporting an armed man threatening residents in our neighborhood. The dispatcher assured me that officers were being dispatched immediately, but mentioned they were currently short-staffed due to a multi-car accident on the highway that had tied up most of their available units. It could be 15 minutes before anyone arrived to help. 15 minutes is an eternity when someone you love is walking into a situation involving an unstable person with a gun. I paced our living room frantically, jumping at every small sound, praying that Jessica's extensive training would keep her safe. After what felt like hours but was actually only 6 agonizing minutes, I couldn't stand the waiting any longer. I grabbed my car keys and headed toward Michael's house 3 doors down. As I approached, I could see Doug standing on Michael's front porch, one hand resting obviously on his holstered gun while the other pointed aggressively at Michael's security cameras. Jessica was already there, positioned strategically between Michael and Doug with a stance that appeared casual to the untrained eye, but was clearly tactical to anyone who knew what to look for. I stayed back at a safe distance, not wanting to escalate an already dangerous situation, but close enough to hear Doug's increasingly angry demands. "Those cameras are a direct violation of HOA privacy standards," he was shouting, his voice carrying the unhinged edge of someone who'd lost all perspective on reality. "They're recording common areas without proper authorization. Take them down immediately, or face fines of $100 per day, plus immediate removal at your expense." Michael stood his ground in his doorway, showing remarkable courage in the face of an armed man's threats. "The cameras are positioned entirely on my own property, recording only my own property boundaries. That's completely legal under state law, and there are no HOA regulations that can legally override basic property rights." Doug's face flushed with frustrated anger. "I'm not asking again, and I'm not negotiating. The HOA board has determined that these surveillance devices violate Section 12 of our community covenant regarding unauthorized monitoring of common areas." Jessica's voice cut through the tension with calm authority. "Sir, I've reviewed the complete Oakwood Estates covenant thoroughly. Section 12 specifically addresses landscape maintenance schedules and seasonal decorating guidelines. There is absolutely no provision anywhere in the document that restricts homeowners from installing security cameras on their own property." Her precise knowledge of the regulations clearly caught Doug completely off guard, destroying his assumed position of authority. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "This doesn't concern you, lady. Mind your own business. I'm Jessica Mitchell." A family friend staying temporarily with the Mitchells, she replied evenly. And actually, this situation does concern me, since you appear to be threatening a law-abiding homeowner without any legal authority whatsoever. The situation explodes. The confrontation escalated rapidly after Jessica's calm interference. Doug, clearly frustrated by her refusal to be intimidated and her superior knowledge of the actual regulations, made the fateful decision to pull his gun. "You people just don't understand how things work in this neighborhood," he snarled, waving the weapon between Jessica and Michael with the reckless movements of someone who'd never received proper firearms training. When HOA security tells you to take down those cameras, you take down the damn cameras. No discussion, no debate. Instead of showing the fear he was clearly expecting, Jessica glanced at the gun with what appeared to be clinical, professional interest. "Interesting technique," she observed with unsettling calm. "Only amateurs hold a weapon like that with their finger already on the trigger. That's a very dangerous way to handle a firearm." Her casual critique of his gun handling skills seemed to infuriate Doug even further, pushing him completely over the edge. "You think this is some kind of joke?" he screamed, losing all remaining composure. "I'll show you exactly how serious I am about enforcing community standards." He raised the gun toward the sky and fired a single shot, presumably meant to demonstrate his willingness to use the weapon and terrorize us into submission. What happened next was so fast that I could barely follow the sequence of movements. In one impossibly fluid motion, Jessica stepped forward and inside Doug's reach, her right hand striking his wrist with precise force while her left hand controlled his elbow. The gun clattered harmlessly to the concrete porch as she continued the movement, efficiently twisting his arm behind his back and taking him to the ground with textbook tactical precision. Doug's face registered complete shock and confusion as he found himself immobilized face down on the porch, with Jessica's knee maintaining controlled pressure on his back, while she secured his wrists with movements that spoke of extensive training and experience. "Michael," she said in the same calm tone she'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation, "could you please pick up that weapon very carefully, using your shirt to avoid disturbing any fingerprints? Handle it only by the grip." Michael complied immediately, his expression showing a mixture of shock and deep admiration for what he'd just witnessed. "And Mrs. Mitchell," Jessica continued, acknowledging me where I stood frozen at the edge of the lawn. "Perfect timing. Could you please inform the responding officers that we have an armed suspect safely detained and disarmed?" Law enforcement arrives. The police arrived within moments, approaching the scene with appropriate caution given the nature of our emergency call. Jessica immediately identified herself as FBI, showing credentials that I hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The lead officer's entire demeanor changed once he confirmed her identity, becoming noticeably more deferential as they took custody of Doug and secured the weapon as evidence. This individual discharged a firearm in a residential area while making threats against civilians, Jessica explained in the crisp, professional tone she used for official reports. "The weapon appears to be carried without a valid permit, based on information we've received through federal law enforcement channels." She provided a concise, detailed statement about everything she had witnessed, and the officers seemed genuinely grateful for her clear, law enforcement-style documentation of the incident. As Doug was being placed in the back of the police car, still looking dazed and confused about how quickly his position of power had evaporated, Richard Connors came screeching around the corner and pulled up to the curb. He rushed toward the scene with the frantic energy of someone whose carefully constructed scheme was falling apart in real time. "What's going on here?" he demanded, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "Doug works for me, for the HOA board. Whatever happened here must be some sort of misunderstanding that we can resolve internally." The lead officer blocked his approach with professional firmness. "Sir, I need you to step back immediately. This man discharged a firearm during a threatening confrontation with residents and is being arrested on multiple weapons violations and assault charges." Richard's face contorted with rage and disbelief as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "This is absolutely ridiculous. You can't arrest our authorized security officer for doing his assigned job. Who made these ridiculous accusations?" His eyes swept over me, then Jessica, then Michael, clearly trying to identify targets for his inevitable retaliation. "I'll have your badges for this harassment of HOA officials." The officer was completely unimpressed by Richard's bluster and threats. "Sir, unless you want to join your associate in custody for interfering with an ongoing arrest, I strongly suggest you step back and remain quiet." As Richard was forced to watch Doug being driven away in the back of a police car, he brushed past Jessica with a whispered threat that was clearly meant to intimidate her. "You've made a very serious mistake here today," he hissed. "You have absolutely no idea who we are or what we're capable of doing to people who cross us." Jessica's response was a serene smile that somehow managed to be more threatening than any angry words could have been. "That's funny," she replied quietly. "That's exactly what I was about to say to you." The retaliation campaign. Richard's retaliation was swift. calculated, and designed to demonstrate that he still controlled the neighborhood despite Doug's arrest. The next morning, our mailbox was completely stuffed with violation notices, 17 separate citations ranging from unapproved landscape modifications, referring to the red X that Doug himself had spray painted on our lawn, to unauthorized security equipment installation. Our perfectly legal security cameras, each violation, carried a minimum fine of $100, creating an instant financial burden of $1,700 in fabricated penalties. That night, someone systematically destroyed all the flowers in our front garden, pulling plants from the ground and scattering them across our lawn in a deliberate act of vandalism. Our security footage showed 2 teenagers doing the damage, but their faces were covered and they were careful to avoid any angles that would allow clear identification. The message was unmistakable. Richard had resources and allies beyond just Doug, and he wasn't backing down from this fight. Meanwhile, Agent Thomas Davis informed Jessica that the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had decided to accelerate their investigation into the Oakwood Estates HOA, based on the compelling evidence we'd provided and the escalation to physical threats and weapons charges. We've been building a comprehensive case against several coordinated HOA fraud schemes operating throughout this region, he explained during a conference call. Richard Connor's operation appears to be one significant node in a much larger criminal network. The physical intimidation and weapons charges add serious weight to what was previously focused primarily on financial crimes. Karen continued, providing inside information at considerable personal risk, delivering copies of financial records that showed nearly $500,000 systematically diverted from legitimate HOA funds through fake service contracts to shell companies owned by Richard's relatives. The Community Fights Back organized a meeting of concerned homeowners at a restaurant outside our neighborhood to avoid the surveillance cameras and listening devices that Karen had warned us about. 23 residents attended that first meeting, and many shared remarkably similar stories of harassment, selective enforcement of rules, and mysterious property damage that occurred whenever they questioned Richard's leadership decisions. Together, we formed what we called the Fair Homeowners Alliance and drafted a formal petition demanding a special election to replace the entire current board with representatives who would actually serve the community's interests, rather than their own financial schemes. Karen, still maintaining her cover as Richard's loyal secretary, informed us that Richard was absolutely furious about the growing organized opposition to his authority. He had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting and placed membership termination procedures prominently on the agenda, a thinly veiled threat to have me expelled from the community entirely. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, and I knew this would be our final confrontation with Richard's regime. The final showdown. The emergency meeting was held on a Tuesday evening that felt charged with the electricity of an approaching storm. Jessica and I arrived at the community center to find the room packed beyond capacity, with Richard, his 3 remaining board allies, and their attorney seated at the front table like a tribunal preparing for judgment. Doug's conspicuous absence served as a stark reminder of how quickly the balance of power could shift. When bullies finally faced real consequences for their actions, Richard called the meeting to order with barely contained fury. We are facing an organized effort to undermine the standards and values that have made Oakwood Estates the premier residential community in this entire region, he began, his voice tight with anger. Certain new residents, he continued, his glare fixed directly on me with obvious malice, have demonstrated blatant disregard for our established rules and community standards. Even worse, they have actively incited other residents to join their disruptive and destructive behavior. He turned to his attorney, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. Mr. Brennan will now outline the HOA board's legal authority to terminate membership for residents who pose a direct threat to our community standards and property values. I had come prepared for this moment, bringing my own legal colleague, Patricia Reyes, who specialized in HOA law and had battled Richard's type of corruption many times before in other communities. When Richard attempted to prevent me from speaking during the public comment period, multiple residents stood up simultaneously in vocal protest. "Let her speak," Michael called out from the back of the room, his voice backed by a growing chorus of agreement from throughout the crowd. Richard's face darkened as he realized he'd lost control of the room and could no longer intimidate the community into silence. I approached the microphone with years of courtroom experience guiding every step, laying out a comprehensive case about the financial mismanagement, systematic selective enforcement, and the clear pattern of targeting specific properties for harassment and forced sales. I was careful not to reveal everything we knew, saving key evidence for the potential criminal proceedings that were already underway. But I presented enough documented proof to make it absolutely clear that this wasn't just a personal grievance or a simple dispute over parking regulations. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically when Karen unexpectedly stood up from her secretary position at the side table. "Everything Mrs. Mitchell has said is completely true," she announced, her voice growing stronger with each word. I have extensive documentation proving all of the financial irregularities she's described, and much more evidence that I've been collecting for nearly 2 years. Richard's face went from red to white in a matter of seconds. Karen, sit down immediately, he commanded. You are completely out of order and speaking without authorization. But Karen had clearly reached her breaking point and was no longer willing to remain silent. I've personally witnessed board members intimidating residents, falsifying violation records, and systematically misappropriating community funds for years. She continued, her voice now carrying throughout the completely silent room. I have kept detailed records and copies of everything, and I'm prepared to share all of it with the appropriate authorities. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and angry voices as residents began to grasp the full scope of the corruption they'd been living under. Richard, losing all pretense of control or legitimate authority, shouted above the growing noise, "This meeting is hereby adjourned. Everyone needs to leave immediately." But absolutely no one moved toward the exits. Instead, Linda Thompson stood up with the dignity and authority that came from her years as an investigative journalist. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board, as specifically permitted under Article 8 of our community bylaws during any official meeting where proper quorum is present, she announced, clearly. The motion was seconded immediately from multiple voices throughout the room. Richard stormed out of the meeting, shouting threats about how everyone will regret this decision as he slammed the door behind him with the petulant fury of a dethroned tyrant. The remaining board members, seeing the unified opposition and fearing legal consequences for their own involvement, quickly began claiming that they had been unaware of Richard's actions and had simply been following his leadership without questioning his decisions. The community membership voted overwhelmingly to remove the entire existing board and schedule proper elections with full transparency and accountability measures in place. The final trap as Jessica and I drove home after the meeting. We felt cautiously victorious, but Jessica warned me that cornered criminals often become more dangerous than ever when they realize their schemes are collapsing around them. Her words proved to be prophetic in the most terrifying way possible. When we arrived home that night, we immediately noticed that our front door lock had been forced open, leaving scratches and damage that indicated professional-level lockpicking or bypass techniques. From the darkness inside our own house, Richard's voice called out with cold menace. We need to have a private conversation, just the three of us. And this time, no one's calling the police until we've reached an understanding. My heart began pounding as Jessica motioned for me to stay behind her, her right hand instinctively moving toward her hip, where her service weapon would normally be holstered. But she was off duty, on vacation, and completely unarmed. Richard, she called calmly into the darkened house. Breaking and entering is a federal crime. Add that to brandishing weapons and making threats, and you're looking at serious federal prison time. A harsh, bitter laugh echoed from our living room. Close the door behind you, he commanded. We have important business to discuss. I know exactly who you are now, Jessica Mitchell. Richard's voice continued from the shadows as we entered cautiously. My friends at the police department ran comprehensive background checks after yesterday's incident. FBI Tactical Operations Commander. Quite impressive credentials, I'll admit. But even federal agents need to sleep sometimes, and accidents can happen to anyone, anywhere. We entered our own living room to find Richard seated comfortably in my favorite armchair, a large handgun resting casually on his knee like some sort of twisted prop in his final performance. Jessica assessed the entire situation with a single, quick glance, noting exit routes, distances, potential weapons, and Richard's psychological state before focusing her complete attention on the armed man who had invaded our home. What's your endgame here, Richard? She asked with remarkable calm. You've already lost complete control of the HOA. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit has been investigating you and your operation for months. Your smartest move right now would be to walk away with whatever money you've already stolen and disappear before this gets any worse for you. I noticed Jessica subtly pressing something in her pocket, and I realized she was activating her phone's recording function and probably triggering the hidden security cameras we'd installed throughout the house. Richard's smile was cold and calculating. Very direct approach. Agent Mitchell, I can appreciate that kind of honesty, so I'll be equally direct with you. He held up a thick legal document with his free hand while keeping the gun steady and pointed in our general direction. This is a complete retraction of all accusations, signed by both of you, along with your immediate commitment to sell this property and leave our community permanently. In return for your cooperation, he continued, I'm prepared to be generous, $50,000 above your original purchase price. You sign these documents right now, we all move on with our lives, and everyone stays healthy and happy. He gestured meaningfully with the gun. Refuse my reasonable offer, and things get very complicated very quickly for both of you. Jessica tilted her head with apparent curiosity. So your master plan is just more threats and intimidation. You do realize that's exactly what got you into this entire mess in the first place, right? The confession for the next 20 minutes. Jessica masterfully kept Richard talking, drawing him into detailed explanations of his schemes, his justifications, and his sense of entitlement to control our entire neighborhood. She led him through a conversation that extracted confessions to multiple serious crimes while appearing to be nothing more than negotiating the terms of our surrender. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, she said at one point, her tone suggesting genuine interest in his business model. You and your brother-in-law's investment firm have been systematically targeting specific properties because they complete a development block that will be worth millions more after the commercial rezoning goes through city planning next month. Richard, feeling completely in control with his weapon and believing he held all the power in this negotiation, became increasingly boastful about the sophistication of his operation. 34 properties acquired over 3 years, he bragged. Most of them at 20 to 30% below actual market value. Once the commercial rezoning is approved next month, we'll clear a minimum of $7 million in profit. The idiots who sold to us never even realized what was coming to this area, as Richard continued revealing details about the shell companies, the kickbacks to city planning officials, and the coordination with other corrupt HOAs throughout the region. I watched Jessica patiently building a comprehensive recorded confession that would destroy him in any courtroom. When she asked about Doug's role in the operation, Richard's contempt was obvious. Doug's a useful idiot, he said dismissively, good for intimidating elderly residents and placing violation notices, but too stupid for anything requiring real intelligence. He'll take the weapons charges and keep his mouth shut if he knows what's good for him. I have enough compromising information on half the police department to ensure this all disappears. Quietly, Jessica nodded sympathetically. It must be incredibly frustrating dealing with incompetent help when you're running such a sophisticated operation. Is that why you decided to handle our situation personally instead of delegating it? Richard's ego couldn't resist taking credit for his tactical brilliance. Some situations require a personal touch and professional expertise. Your mother was becoming a dangerous rallying point for all the malcontents in the community. You proved to be unexpectedly resourceful and well-connected. Together, you threatened 3 years of careful planning and millions in potential profits. He leaned forward slightly, still maintaining control of the weapon. Sometimes you have to remove obstacles decisively and permanently to protect a larger investment. Richard finally lost patience with the extended conversation. Enough talking, he snapped, raising the gun to point directly at me. Sign those documents right now, or I'll stage this to look like a tragic home invasion gone wrong. Your daughter might have FBI training, but even she can't move faster than a bullet at this range. Jessica remained unnervingly calm in the face of a direct death threat. Before you pull that trigger, Richard, there are 2 important things you should probably know about your current situation. First, she said conversationally, that gun you're holding so confidently was reported stolen from the police evidence room 3 years ago. That's part of why you were forced into early retirement. I'm guessing Richard's expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty he'd shown. Second, Jessica continued, this entire conversation has been transmitted live to my colleague, Agent Thomas Davis, who is currently positioned down the street with a full tactical response team. Richard's momentary confusion and distraction gave Jessica the precise opening she needed. With explosive speed and flawless technique, she executed a perfect disarming maneuver, stepping inside his aim while simultaneously controlling his wrist and removing the weapon from his grasp before he could react or pull the trigger. In the same fluid motion, she twisted his arm behind his back and forced him face down onto our living room floor with the kind of professional precision that comes from years of tactical training. Richard Connors, she announced formally, maintaining perfect control of her suspect. You're under arrest for breaking and entering, attempted extortion, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and approximately a dozen other charges that we'll sort out during processing. At that exact moment, our front door burst open and Agent Thomas Davis entered with 4 FBI agents in full tactical gear, weapons drawn and ready. Perfect timing, as always, Jessica said calmly, not even slightly out of breath despite having just disarmed a dangerous criminal in our living room. Our friend here has been extremely informative and cooperative. Richard's face contorted with shock, rage, and disbelief as he was professionally handcuffed. You can't do this to me. Do you people have any idea who I am? I have powerful friends in the police department, the district attorney's office, city planning commission. Jessica cut him off mid-sentence. In the police department, the DA's office, and city planning. Yes, we know all about your network of corrupt contacts. They're all being investigated too. The Financial Crimes Task Force has been watching your entire operation for months. Your little HOA scam was just the tip of the iceberg that led us to a much bigger criminal enterprise. Agent Thomas nodded. respectfully to Jessica as his team secured Richard for transport. Any additional instructions, Commander Mitchell? Richard's eyes widened in shock at hearing Jessica's full title and rank. Commander, he whispered. Jessica's smile was filled with quiet satisfaction. Special Tactical Operations Commander, FBI Chicago Field Office. And you just threatened my mother at gunpoint in her own home. She paused for effect. That wasn't your smartest tactical decision, Richard. Justice and Community Restoration. 1 week later, our backyard was filled with neighbors celebrating at an impromptu community barbecue that felt like a genuine festival of liberation. News of Richard and Doug's arrests had spread quickly throughout the neighborhood, along with details about the larger FBI investigation into HOA fraud schemes operating across multiple counties. Linda Thompson had been unanimously elected as interim HOA president, with Karen serving as treasurer and Michael heading a newly formed Transparency and Accountability Committee. The atmosphere was celebratory but also deeply cathartic, as many residents finally felt safe enough to share stories of intimidation and harassment they'd previously been too frightened to discuss openly. I can't believe we all put up with their bullying for so long, one elderly gentleman told me, shaking his head in amazement. We were each so isolated, thinking we were the only ones being specifically targeted. Divide and conquer, Linda observed knowingly. It's one of the oldest tactics in the authoritarian playbook. Keep people afraid and isolated, and they won't organize effective resistance. Jessica was helping serve drinks and mingling naturally with our neighbors, looking completely relaxed and at home in this community for the first time since her arrival. She had officially requested a transfer to the FBI's Chicago field office to be closer to family and to continue working on the expanding real estate fraud investigation. This whole experience made me realize I've been living too far from the people who matter most to me, she told me quietly as we watched children playing safely on our newly restored lawn. Besides, there's clearly important work to be done here. The real estate fraud investigation is expanding into a multi-state operation, and I want to see it through to completion. I couldn't have been happier about her decision to relocate, though I still worried about the higher-risk tactical assignments that were part of her job. Reading my maternal concern, she squeezed my hand reassuringly. Don't worry, Mom. Most of my work involves organizational analysis and white-collar crime investigation. The tactical team operations are just one part of what I do, and they're actually safer than you might think. National impact and legacy. The Oakwood Estates case attracted significant national media attention, highlighting the growing problem of HOA abuse and the use of homeowners associations as vehicles for sophisticated real estate fraud schemes. Several investigative journalists contacted me for interviews, and a state senator reached out about strengthening legislation to provide better oversight of HOA governance and ensure transparency in community management. I agreed to serve as legal consultant for our newly reorganized HOA board, helping to completely rewrite our community covenant to remove unenforceable provisions and establish clear, specific rights and protections for homeowners. The victory felt important far beyond just our own neighborhood. It represented a small but significant pushback against the abuse of power that can flourish in even the most ordinary settings when good people remain silent and isolated. 3 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom as Richard Connors and Doug Peterson faced a judge for final sentencing. The prosecution had built an absolutely airtight case, supported by Karen's meticulous financial records, the recorded confession from our living room, and extensive documentation uncovered by the FBI's ongoing investigation. Richard had desperately tried to implicate other conspirators and minimize his own culpability, but the evidence was overwhelming, and his credibility was completely destroyed. His attempts to intimidate potential witnesses from jail had only added additional charges to his already extensive list of federal crimes. Jessica testified in her full FBI dress uniform, her professional demeanor and commanding presence leaving absolutely no doubt about the seriousness of Richard's threats against our family and our community. The federal judge was unsparing in her final assessment of Richard's crimes and character. Mr. Connors, you systematically abused the position of neighborhood trust to orchestrate a sophisticated fraud scheme that used intimidation and threats of violence against the very homeowners you were elected to represent and protect, she stated with moral authority. That filled the courtroom. Your actions demonstrate a deeply disturbing pattern of escalation that culminated in armed home invasion and death threats against innocent residents. This court finds your behavior to be particularly reprehensible given your background in law enforcement. Richard stared straight ahead with the hollow expression of a man watching his entire world collapse around him. This court sentenced you to 15 years in federal prison for the combined charges, plus full financial restitution to the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association and all affected residents. Doug received 8 years for his role in the conspiracy, with the judge noting that his cooperation with investigators had earned him some degree of leniency. As we left the courthouse after justice had finally been served, A reporter asked how it felt to successfully take down what she called an HOA tyrant. I thought about the fear I'd felt when Richard broke into our home, the anger when Doug vandalized our property, and the gradual sense of empowerment as neighbors united against systematic bullying and corruption. It feels like remembering that even small injustices matter deeply, I replied, and that standing up to abuse of power sometimes requires an entire community working together, not just individual resistance, Jessica added with her characteristic smile, and sometimes it requires bullies being foolish enough to point guns at exactly the wrong person's mother. A new beginning back in Oakwood Estates. Life had been completely transformed. Our newly elected HOA board operated with unprecedented transparency, posting all financial records online and conducting genuinely open meetings where residents felt heard and respected. The previously intimidated community had found its collective voice, creating the kind of vibrant neighborhood that actually delivered on those original promises of neighbors becoming family. On our front lawn, exactly where Doug had once spray-painted his threatening red X, we placed a small humorous sign that read, "This area protected by FBI. Think twice before pointing guns." It always made visitors laugh. But for our family, it represented something much more profound about the importance of standing up to bullies, regardless of whatever official-looking uniforms or badges of authority they might claim to possess. Sometimes, to effectively handle a neighborhood bully, all you really need is a determined mother, a daughter with very specialized professional skills, a community that finally refuses to be afraid, and perhaps just a little bit of luck when the bad guys are foolish enough to threaten exactly the wrong family. The red X that was meant to mark us as targets became a symbol of our resistance, and ultimately, our victory over those who thought they could use fear to steal our homes and destroy our community. In the end, Richard Connors discovered that real authority comes from serving others, not from dominating them, and Doug Peterson learned that pointing guns at people requires being absolutely certain. You know who you're threatening, they picked the wrong house. They had no idea who we were, and that mistake cost them everything while giving our community back its freedom, its safety, and its future.